I'm going to give just a brief overview of some cave restoration work we've been doing in Smith County, Tennessee. If you don't know me, I'm Cory Holliday. I am the Cave and Karst Program Director for the Nature Conservancy here in Tennessee. Been doing cave work in Tennessee for almost 20 years. And I need to get out more. I see a lot of faces I don't really know very well. But just wanted to give an overview of a little bit about Piper Cave and what's going on there. This is a photograph of the cave when I first visited in 2010. The previous landowner gave me permission to go and count some bats, and it's a summer maternity site, and we usually count the bats by filming the emergence. So I walked down to the cave and I looked at the entrance. I said, well, I don't think too many bats are going to be flying out of that. And there's a little tiny crack you can see in the fencing that's in that hole. And lo and behold, there were still bats in there, and they were flying in and out through that hole. But Piper Caves in Smith County, generally, kind of well known in the caving community. It was in Matthew's 1971 book, and it's kind of known as a really significant saltpeter site. Has some old signatures, has these old barrel-shaped saltpeter vats. I think that's the only instance that those have been documented. Unfortunately, they were destroyed by a landowner sometime after this photograph was taken. And it's a long and storied tale of Piper Cave. But it's in Barr's book. This is the map that is in Barr's book. Folks that have been there, you can see the entrance here. The main entrance is on the right side of that map. And you can see the saltpeter vats documented, down this long passage. There are 17 saltpeter vats on this map. And talking to Dr. Douglas, it seems likely that those individual vats that are on this map are probably individual areas that contained more than one vat per block on this space. So it was a really prolific saltpeter mine at some point, probably over a long period of time. But it's a gray bat maternity cave. The first biological records we have from there are from Merlin Tuttle. He visited the cave in 1969 and estimated almost 30,000 bats utilizing the cave. And then Dr. Mick Harvey from here at Tennessee Tech visited in 1986 and 2002 with decreased numbers there. And sort of the story of this cave is that had this long history of different landowners. From the 70s and 80s, it was generally, as I understand it, more or less closed to people, but there was some activity going on in the cave that the bats didn't really care for. And then in 1998, it was purchased by James Lovelace to sort of turn into a Y2K bunker. He was one of the people convinced that the world was going to end in the year 2000, and he chose this cave as his site to sort of ride out the apocalypse. And he ran a bulldozer through the cave, demolished just about all of the saltpeter remnants, all of the vats and the piping systems and things of that nature, created a second entrance to the cave. And as you can see by Mick Harvey's numbers of the bats in 2002, pretty much ran the bats out of the place. He constructed walls at the natural entrance and the artificial entrance that he created, and changed the microclimate of the cave and just the general temperature and humidity throughout the cave. And I first visited the cave in 2010 when that picture was taken. And we actually had about 2,500 or so bats come out through that little slot in the fence. And at the time I was watching bats swarm. I could see them on my thermal camera behind that little cutout in the gate. I could see a lot more than it seemed like were coming out. And I walked around a little bit. I asked the landowner if there was another entrance. He said, oh yeah, I bulldozed one back here. And I walked around while my camera was still recording, and sure enough, there were bats swarming out of the second entrance. And I revisited again the second year and set up on the second entrance and had a higher number of bats, but still, nothing near the historic numbers that had been documented by previous researchers. So gray bats, I just give a little plug for them. They're an endangered species. They were listed as an endangered species in 1976. At that time, it was estimated there were around somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million bats throughout their range, which kind of sounds like a lot, but the scientists at the time knew that that was a shadow of what they had been years prior and decades prior. And they're kind of a southeastern and Ozark bat. They occur only in southeastern cave regions and in the Ozarks. They're cave obligate bats. They hibernate in caves, but they also spend their summers almost exclusively in caves. They form maternity roosts and bachelor colonies. And then in the wintertime, they are really unique. They kind of put a lot of their eggs in just a few baskets. So there are about 15 hibernacula that support the entire species of gray bats. And of those 15 caves, 4 are in Tennessee. This map with the red and green dots are all of the known roosts for gray bats throughout their range. So you can see the power that, we have more in Tennessee than anywhere else. And the power of conservation that we have for these animals to recover from an endangered status or to remain endangered, we have more influence over that in Tennessee than anywhere else. So the Nature Conservancy has really focused on gray bats for a long, long time. Merlin Tuttle came to us in the early 1980s, and it really pushed us to get into cave conservation and bat conservation more than we had been. Through that relationship, we purchased Hubbard's Cave in 1983 and 4, and that really kicked off our cave conservation and bat conservation program. And gray bats are just really, really unique. There's been a lot of research about sort of their social elements. They form these kind of family and social groups, and they share resources and compete with other groups, but sort of as a team. And then they come together in these, hundreds of thousands of bats in our 4 caves in Tennessee in the wintertime. Hubbard's has over 500,000 bats. We have a couple of caves that have around 350,000, and then Rattling is around 250,000 or so. And then in the summertime, they're more dispersed. So most of the green dots are summer sites, and they spread out. But they're still in groups of, 5 to 15,000 is most common. We have one site in Tennessee with about 250,000 bats in the summertime up around Clarksville. But they're really, really interesting and unique animals that we have a lot of influence over in Tennessee in regards to conserving and helping recover those bats. We think there's somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 of these bats throughout their range now, and a million. Somewhere between 5 and 6 million. And about 1.5 million of those are in Tennessee in the wintertime. The summertime, we really don't know. They're kind of challenging to count and survey these little things that fly. But Piper Cave is an opportunity to really recover the species. So it's a site that had 30,000 or so bats in the 60s when the bats were already in decline. Doesn't have a lot of bats now, so it's an opportunity to sort of move the needle towards recovery of this endangered species. So this is the cave now. It has been sort of leveled. The main pathway through the cave is pretty flat and smooth and been leveled by a bulldozer. And then it's filled with mostly barrels full of stuff that have, because the entrances were closed off, it created this really high humidity environment. The barrels have pretty much rusted. A lot of the barrels have rusted through, making it really challenging to move them out of there without destroying the contents. And there's just a lot of loose debris and stuff, and it is just a darn mess. When I was writing grants to fundraise for this project, I really wanted to call it the most impacted and the most trashed cave in Tennessee. I don't know if that's true. By volume or by weight, it probably has more human-made stuff in it than any other cave in the state. I don't really know that, though. But it is full of a lot of stuff. There are just, that's a 30-foot camper. We have, yeah, I'll get into that in a minute, yeah. And this is an artificial entrance. This on the map in Barr's book was listed as a breakdown collapse area. But now that since they ran the bulldozer through and moved the breakdown out, subsequently this collapse occurred right underneath a mobile home that was set there, and there is a large tank that has fallen in the cave in that same area. So we started the restoration. We had an opportunity to purchase the cave. So there have been Mr. Lovelace gave up on the end of the world and decided, he was getting too old to ride it out anyway, I guess. Sold the cave to a neighbor. The Nature Conservancy couldn't move fast enough to buy it at that time. That was about maybe 5 years ago. And then that neighbor decided to sell it about 3 years later. And again, we couldn't move fast enough. We're a nonprofit organization. We always have to have an appraisal before we can even make a handshake offer. And before we could get an appraiser on the ground, the property sold. It sold to another neighbor, Michael Mast. And Mr. Mast had planned to build a house on the site. And he started a cleanup effort and cleaned up a lot of the outside area. The area immediately around the cave kind of looked like the inside of the cave. There was just piles and piles of junk. There were 3 mobile homes out there where he'd kind of live in one until it was not livable anymore. He'd slide in another one, live in it for a while. And so there was a series of 3 of those, and just kind of a lot of junk and old vehicles and stuff. And Mr. Mast, when he bought the property, he cleaned most of that up, but hadn't touched inside the cave. But he actually owned it less than a year, and he couldn't get a septic permit for the size house he wanted. Decided to sell the cave, and we'd already established a relationship, and he was inspired to do the best thing he could for the cave and for the bats. He told me he wrote a paper about endangered species in middle school, and he wrote about black-footed ferrets, and he's always had sort of a soft spot for endangered species since then. And he waited for us to be able to buy the cave. As you all know that live in Tennessee, it has been an insane real estate market of late. And he sold his cave to us for appraised value and waited 4.5 months for us to be able to close the deal, and was just very generous with his time. And honestly, he could have sold the cave for a lot more on the just general real estate market to a just normal, regular private citizen. But we were very fortunate to be able to buy the cave. We closed in October of 2021. We get these little windows, so we knew that about the bats in the summertime, that it had at least had capacity to support large numbers of bats, and we had a few thousand using it. I had done I think 3 winter bat surveys there, and had seen some interesting species, but never in really large numbers. So when Mr. Mast owned the property, we were able to get the entrance barriers largely opened up so bats could access the cave. We closed on the property in October, planned to start the restoration immediately, but there were still bats there. Since we just in the months, few months that the cave was open, we had several thousand bats come in during the migration period, and we actually had to hold off on our initiating our restoration project until the bats left, and they didn't leave until early November. So I spent about a week just sort of starting to dip my toe into the restoration project in November 2021, rented a skid steer, and just started hauling material out. And just I think I spent either 6 or 7 days there just kind of moving material, but filled up quite a few dumpsters, got a lot of chemicals out of there. I think I had about 24,000 pounds of just trash moved out in that initial just 1 week phase of moving stuff out. And it's all stuff that you need for an apocalypse, garden tubs, treadmills, things that you need when the world's going to end. And this is just one of our dumpsters. And this is a little before and after of just one of the passages. But it was clear immediately this is going to be a long project. It's going to take us a long time to complete a restoration at this cave, and we're not going to be able to do it alone. And we were able to work with Upper Cumberland Grotto and the Nashville Grotto this March, and had a volunteer day. And we had a really great turnout. A lot of people came out to help us clean up the cave and get some trash out of there and really organize some of the just loose stuff. That's the hardest bit, is there's just so much loose stuff out in the cave to be cleaned up. And we had a great time. Dr. Douglas we started the day with Dr. Douglas, giving a tour of the cave. There's so much history in the cave and cultural resources that are not my specialty. I was really grateful that Joe was able to come out and talk about all of that. You can see the wire in the background. This is Chuck. The volunteers pulled out hundreds and hundreds of feet of wire and cable that was through the cave where it had lighting in it at one time and electricity. There was a large generator outside the cave. We found a couple 55-gallon drums of diesel fuel inside the cave. So he was planning to have electricity and be ready to go. This is Dr. Douglas with his face strategically blocked, but he's talking to the group there about some of the cultural resources that he found. I don't think I've got a photograph of that here. I'll probably mangle it, but as I understand it, Joe collected, I think we went New Year's Day, and to just sort of get some other scientists in there other than biologists and see what other resources there may be that the Nature Conservancy needs to think about in our future management of the site. Dr. Douglas collected a cane charcoal sample on that trip and had it dated, and I think it was around 4,000 years before present, which, as I understand it, is that the fifth oldest for Tennessee? Yeah, so pretty significant, and really eye-opening to me that even though this cave has been, it's been really heavily impacted, we were just wandering through fairly casually, and Joe immediately, finds this cache of stuff that is pretty significant cultural resources still in the cave, still right on the main path. I think there's a lot yet to be discovered and found, and we're hopeful to work with additional researchers as well as Dr. Douglas in the future to understand how we can best manage this site. I think there was some some gear recovered from the cave, some repurposed materials found. But we had a great day out there with everybody. I think everybody that came had a good time. It's an opportunity to see a cave that most cavers haven't been able to get into for a long time. We did build a gate subsequent to the volunteer day on the second entrance. This is the artificial entrance. And we'd had quite a bit of trespassing going on this site, mostly locals that know about the cave coming in to see what they can raid out of there. We have one person in particular that had been cited on 3 occasions for trespassing. Couldn't care less. He kept coming back. I had a camera on the cave entrance. He'd kind of look at it as he came by, and I could see his hands full as he was on his way out. So we did gate that entrance and worked to put a bat-friendly cave gate on there. And we're going to experiment with blocking that entrance a little bit once we get some instrumentation in there, because we believe, as far as we can tell, that entrance didn't exist as a natural open-air entrance until around 1999 or 2000. Already talked a little bit about this, but there are scant remnants of the saltpeter mining operation that was there. There are some hollowed out logs for water movement, and just a little bit of remnant of the saltpeter vats. You can see some V-shaped vats there, and then some of the river cane charcoal that Dr. Douglas is collecting. And it's going to be a long project. I think it's going to take us about 3 years to get it cleaned up. There will be future opportunities for folks to come out and help, and we will take all of the help we can get. This is a tanning bed in this picture that I pulled out because, you want to look good at the end of the world. But the tanning bed was right over a bat roost, and it was covered with guano. And just good stuff. It's, kind of hilarious, kind of sad, but we're grateful for the people that have turned out and helped us with this project so far, and we're just hoping to keep it going. And hopefully one day, we'll claim success of, restoring and recovering a great bat colony and a great Tennessee cave. And that's all I've got. Thank you. Dr. Douglas. Thank you.